A foster mother sat quietly in the last row, until the man on trial called her out by a name no one expected. What happened next left even the judge speechless. The scent of old wood and paper lingered in the air as morning sunlight spilled through the tall, arched windows of the Fayette County Courthouse. Dust particles drifted lazily in the golden beams, casting a gentle haze over the quiet tension that hung inside the room. It was the kind of courtroom that hadn't changed in decades. Polished oak benches, creaking floorboards, and a judge's bench elevated with a sense of unshakable permanence. In the back row, a woman sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Clara Jenkins, late 50s. Her dark skin contrasted with the pale, worn pew beneath her, and her simple attire, a cream blouse, navy cardigan, and modest gray skirt, spoke of quiet dignity. She wore no jewelry except for a faded gold ring on her right hand, and a watch that hadn't ticked in years. Her posture was composed, her gaze steady. She hadn't moved much since she entered nearly 30 minutes ago. Hadn't checked her phone. Hadn't spoken. But her eyes hadn't left the defendant's table for even a moment. Mason Whitaker sat at that table, 28 years old. Light brown hair cropped close, his frame lean but slightly hunched, like someone carrying a weight that wasn't visible. His expression was unreadable. Jaw locked, lips drawn, the kind of stillness that came from years of building walls. Dressed in a faded gray dress shirt and black slacks that didn't quite fit, he looked both younger and older than he was. A man suspended between mistakes and the chance to make something better. He didn't glance at Clara, didn't even seem aware of her presence. But Clara saw everything. The slight twitch of his fingers, the way he avoided the bailiff's eyes, the way he didn't look toward the rows behind him, not even once. At the bench, Judge Arlen Rowe adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was gravel and authority. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, flipping through the papers before him. "You've declined a plea deal, so here we are." He looked over the rim of his glasses, sharp eyes scanning Mason, then briefly, curiously, drifting toward the silent woman at the back. Rowe was no stranger to small-town theatrics. He had seen weeping mothers, pleading girlfriends, belligerent fathers, all hoping to sway the outcome. But this woman didn't weep, she didn't even flinch. He looked back down. The proceedings began. Lawyers exchanged dry phrases, and the courtroom settled into its rhythm. Evidence was read aloud. A probation officer testified. The hum of the ceiling fan overhead was the only relief from the heaviness in the air. Still, Clara sat unmoving. She didn't come with anyone. Didn't introduce herself. When asked at the security checkpoint earlier who she was there to support, she'd simply said, "I'm here for him." It wasn't clear who him was, but to her, there was never any question. From her purse, her fingers brushed the edge of something old, a small, weathered photograph, edges curled from time. She didn't pull it out, just felt for it, the way one checks if a heartbeat still exists. From across the room, Mason adjusted in his chair, his eyes flickering for the briefest moment toward the gallery, toward her. Their eyes didn't meet, but Clara didn't need them to. She was right where she needed to be. The courtroom droned on, statements, objections, exhibits read into the record. But for Clara, the words began to blur, not from disinterest, but from memory. Her hands rested on her purse, her fingers curling slightly, again brushing the outline of the old photograph she hadn't dared to take out yet. The past had a way of pressing through silence, and in this moment it came softly, insistently. Years earlier, her house on Magnolia Street had always smelled like cinnamon and laundry soap. A modest, weathered home with faded yellow siding and a garden she kept more for the children than herself. The kids she took in were all different. Some angry, some shy, others already too old in the eyes. She remembered them all, names etched like rings in a tree. But Mason was different. He had arrived at 11, thin, guarded, with eyes like storm clouds and a silence that didn't break even under the gentlest of voices. His caseworker had warned her, He doesn't connect well. Don't be surprised if he keeps to himself. Clara had only nodded. The first weeks were rough. He flinched at sudden noises, refused to sleep with the light off, and barely spoke. He hoarded food. At night, tucking crackers under his mattress like survival was something you did even in safe places. But Clara didn't push. She just made pancakes every morning, left folded laundry on his bed, sat beside him when he didn't speak, and hummed softly as she stitched his school uniform. Then, one night, as a thunderstorm rolled in and shook the windows, Mason crept from his room and curled wordlessly at her feet. She said nothing, just placed a blanket over him and kept humming. From that night on, he was hers, not legally, not permanently, but in every way that counted. He started calling her Ma under his breath when no one else was around. He brought home spelling tests with stars on them, stuck her name in the corners of his drawings. On his 12th birthday, he made her a card with cut-out letters from an old magazine that read, "You didn't give me life, but you gave me one." Clara had never cried so hard. But a month later, everything shattered. There had been a custody appeal. A misfiled paper. A family member, some distant cousin, petitioned to take him. The agency said it was in his best interest. Clara was told late on a Tuesday. By Friday morning, Mason was gone. She hadn't even gotten to say goodbye. She had fought, of course, wrote letters, made phone calls, pleaded. But the system doesn't bleed for quiet women like Clara. After a while, the case was marked closed, and now, nearly 2 decades later, that boy sat across the room, an adult man now, hollowed and distant. The same, storm in his eyes. He still hadn't looked at her. Clara blinked, returning to the present. The prosecutor was mid-sentence, citing prior infractions. The defense attorney tapped her pen nervously. Mason sat still, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Clara's grip tightened on her purse. She could feel the photograph again, creased, faded, nearly torn in one corner. It was one of the few she'd kept. Him, age 12, standing beside her garden, a small, unsure smile on his face. He wore the blue hoodie she'd sewn a patch onto. His arm, hesitant but proud, had been slung around her waist. He might not remember that day, but she remembered every second. And now she waited for something, anything, that would tell her the boy she'd once loved was still somewhere behind those tired eyes. The judge's gavel struck once, a sharp wooden crack that echoed against the high ceilings. "We'll resume in 20, Judge Rowe said, then stepped away through the side door. Lawyers began gathering notes, adjusting ties, and murmuring among themselves while the courtroom began to rustle and shift. Clara stayed seated, motionless. Her hands remained gently folded over her purse, which still carried the photograph, though she hadn't dared look at it again. She simply waited, not anxiously, not nervously, just faithfully, as if her very presence had purpose. A group of spectators stood chatting near the aisle, 2 women in beige trench coats, their expressions tight, and an older man in a crisp suit whose gaze kept flickering back toward Clara. She felt it without having to look. She'd felt that kind of stare for most of her life. The kind that measured your presence as a question mark in a space not designed for you. "She's probably just someone from the cleaning crew," one of the women whispered, not quite low enough. "I didn't know they let witnesses sit through." The other muttered. A quiet chuckle passed between them. Clara didn't flinch. She kept her posture the same, composed, still. Then came the shuffle of shoes, a soft but purposeful tap of heels. A young white woman, polished early 30s, approached. She wore a navy blazer with an attorney's badge clipped neatly to her lapel. Her expression was polite but uncertain. "Excuse me," she said, gently, leaning in. "Are you lost?" Clara turned her head slowly, her dark eyes steady and warm. "Lost?" she repeated as though tasting the word. The woman hesitated. "I mean, this courtroom's assigned for the Whitaker trial. I wasn't sure if maybe you were looking for the civil hearings next door." A few heads turned nearby. One of the trenchcoat women pretended not to listen while clearly eavesdropping. Clara's reply was soft, but unwavering. "No," she said, with a calm, resolute nod. "I'm right where I need to be." The attorney blinked, unsure how to respond. Clara offered her a kind smile, and with that, the woman murmured a quiet, "Okay," and stepped away. Across the room, something shifted. Mason. He turned. It was brief, a flick of his eyes in Clara's direction, the faintest furrow of his brow. He didn't hold the gaze, didn't speak or acknowledge her, but for a half-second their eyes met, and Clara felt it. Recognition. Foggy. Fragile. Faint. But it was there. He turned back toward the defense table, jaw clenched. His fingers tapped against his thigh in a rhythm only he knew. The room resumed its low murmur, but tension hung in the air. Who was that woman in the back? She wasn't dressed like a lawyer, didn't behave like a relative, and yet she radiated. Something that made even the skeptical glance twice. The questions were unspoken but palpable. Why is she here? What is she waiting for? Who is she to him? Clara exhaled quietly and looked down into her lap. She already knew the answers. She just didn't know if anyone else was ready to hear them. The courtroom settled into an uneasy stillness as the sentencing phase began. The air felt thicker now, weighted with finality. The jury had long exited. The observers remained, scattered in pew-like rows, curious enough to stay for the closing. Moment. Clara sat quietly in the back, spine straight, eyes fixed forward. Judge Arlen Rowe leaned slightly over his bench, glasses perched at the end of his nose as he addressed the defendant. "Mr. Whitaker, before I pass sentencing, you have the right to make a statement if you wish. Is there anything you'd like to say?" Mason didn't move at first. His fingers were laced tightly in front of him, knuckles pale. His attorney gave him a soft nudge. Slowly, he rose. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical. He looked down at the table, then up toward the judge. He cleared his throat. "I don't have much to say." His voice was deeper than it had been, in Clara's memories. Rougher, but beneath it was a familiar timbre, like the low notes of a song she once knew. Mason paused, swallowing hard. His eyes drifted toward the back of the room, and for the first time in the entire trial, he looked directly at Clara, the breath caught in her chest. "I've done a lot wrong," Mason said, voice cracking at the edge, "and I've spent a long time being angry at people who left, or who I thought left." He took a breath. "But when I was a kid, there was this woman. She made pancakes every Saturday. She had a song she hummed when she folded laundry. She sat with me during storms because I was too proud to say I was scared. She called me baby, even when I didn't deserve it." Every head in the courtroom began to turn. I didn't know what that meant back then, but I know now. It meant home. It meant safe. His voice trembled and he dropped his gaze for a moment before lifting it again. "I don't have much family left," he said, softer now. "But if she's still willing to be my mom, I need her now." The courtroom froze. Silence, heavy and electric, fell across the space. One of the defense attorneys stopped scribbling. A bailiff blinked in surprise. The woman in the beige trench coat stared openly. Even Judge Rowe leaned back as though reprocessing what he'd just heard. Clara didn't move. Her face remained composed, but her eyes betrayed everything. They shimmered with unshed tears, the kind that only appear when a wound long thought buried finally breathes again. Her throat tightened, lips parting just slightly, but she didn't speak. She didn't rush forward. She let the moment be his. Mason sat down quickly, as if afraid the words might disappear if he stayed standing too long. The judge adjusted his glasses, brow furrowed, then looked directly at Clara. He studied her for a beat too long. No one said anything, but something in the room had shifted, quietly, irreversibly, and in the stillness the weight of all those lost years, of things left unsaid, of a bond stretched but never broken, hung in the air between them. Clara reached for her purse and gently placed a hand over it, resting again on that worn photograph. Her tears did not fall, not yet. The silence still hung in the courtroom like a heavy curtain, rippling gently with the unspoken emotions that Mason's declaration had unleashed. Judge Rowe hadn't spoken yet. He sat motionless, leaning back in his chair, glasses slightly, lowered, eyes fixed on Clara, not in scrutiny but in recollection. His brow furrowed. He tilted his head slightly. "Ms. Jenkins," he said slowly, not reading it from any paperwork. "Clara Jenkins?" Clara straightened. Her heart thudded, once loud enough that she was sure someone nearby must have heard it. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm, but something behind her eyes flickered. The judge blinked. Once. Twice. Then it hit him. "You were the woman who got Lily to speak again." A collective hush fell over the room once more. Even, Mason, confused, turned his head toward the bench. Judge Rowe leaned forward now, his face visibly softened. "My niece, Lily Martin. She came to live with my sister after her mother passed. Wouldn't talk, not a word for almost a year. And then one day she came home from school humming. Said a Ms. Clara had sung her a song. That same evening she finally said, 'I miss my mama.' First words she'd said in 10 months. His voice faltered at the end. The stern, authoritative tone that had anchored every court proceeding he presided over now shimmered with something. Gentler. Human. I never forgot that, he added. Clara's lips trembled, but she simply nodded. "I remember Lily," she said softly. She had a pink stuffed elephant she couldn't sleep without. A smile broke across Judge Rowe's face, a rare sight in that courtroom. It wasn't a grin of amusement, but of deep recognition, of history shared that had nothing to do with verdicts or sentencing, and everything to do with healing. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure. "Court will take a brief recess." With that, he stood and exited through the side door, but not before casting one last glance toward Clara, a glance that no longer held the distance of authority, but the quiet acknowledgement of something far greater. Around the room, murmurs began, not of judgment this time, but wonder. The spectators who had once whispered with suspicion now stared with curiosity, some even with a kind of reverence. Mason sat still, trying to process what had just unfolded. Clara remained in her seat. She hadn't come here expecting acknowledgement or gratitude or reconnection. But now the courtroom, the very space meant to pass judgment, had transformed. It was no longer just about legal motions or procedural formalities. It was a place where past and present collided, where the invisible threads of love, care, and sacrifice revealed their power. In that moment, Clara wasn't just the woman in the back row. She was the woman who had mended a broken child, twice. The courtroom reconvened 15 minutes later, though something intangible had shifted. The light that streamed through the tall windows seemed softer now, the morning sun catching flecks of dust that danced slowly in the still air. What had once felt like a place of cold deliberation now held the quiet hum of something more profound. Recognition, humanity. Judge Arlen Rowe returned to the bench with a composed expression, but the sharp edge in his voice had dulled into something closer to warmth. He looked at Mason, then at Clara, and let the silence linger, giving weight to what was about to follow. "Mason Whitaker," he began, his voice steady but measured. "This court has reviewed your record, your actions, and now, your words." Mason sat still, hands clasped in front of him, uncertain whether to brace for punishment or something else. "You stand before us a man who has made mistakes. That is not in question," Judge Rowe continued. "But you also stand before us with the rare courage to speak truth where shame usually resides, to recognize the value of someone you once left behind. That, too, is part of your record now." The room was utterly silent. Clara sat perfectly, upright in the back row, lips pressed together, hands folded over the same worn photograph tucked inside her purse. Her heart pounded, but her expression held calm. The judge looked down at his notes for only a second, then set them aside. In light of the mitigating circumstances, and in acknowledgement of your willingness to accept responsibility, not just for your actions but for your personal healing, this court is amending its initial recommendation. Mason blinked. There will be no incarceration, Judge Rowe said clearly. Instead, I am ordering a structured rehabilitation program, followed by 200 hours of community service, preferably with youth mentorship or outreach. You've shown that you needed someone once. Maybe now, you can be that someone for another. Mason's attorney, who had been prepared for the worst, opened his mouth and then quickly shut it again. Even he seemed stunned. But Judge Rowe wasn't finished. He looked up again directly at Clara. This court would also like to take a moment, unusual though it may be, to recognize a form of service that often goes unseen in our system. Clara's eyes widened, just slightly. There are individuals in our communities, foster parents, caregivers, guardians, who take in the broken pieces of others, stitch them together with care, and ask for nothing in return. Ms. Jenkins, he said, voice soft but resonant, you are one of those people. Clara's throat tightened. A tear finally broke free and slid down her cheek. You were not sworn in today, Judge Rowe continued, but let the record show that your presence, your patience, and your love have changed the course of a life. This court acknowledges that. The gallery remained hushed, reverent. Mason turned slightly in his seat, eyes red, jaw tight. When the judge struck his gavel softly to close the proceedings, no one rushed to leave. It was as if the entire courtroom needed a few extra moments to absorb what had just happened. Clara stood slowly. Mason did not approach her, not yet. But his gaze never left her, and this time, she didn't look away. In a space meant for punishment, grace had taken its place, and justice, for once, had felt like healing. The courthouse doors creaked open with a soft metallic groan, and a wave of warm Georgia air drifted in to replace the stillness of the courtroom. Outside, the morning sun had climbed high, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Clara stepped out first, her modest flats quietly tapping against the pavement. Her hands were steady, but her breath trembled slightly. Too many memories stirred at once. Behind her, Mason followed, slower, as if carrying a weight that hadn't quite been lifted, even after the judge's merciful sentence. For a few seconds they stood apart. The sounds of traffic and birdsong filled the space between them. People passed, unaware that something fragile and sacred was unfolding just feet away from the courthouse exit. Then Mason spoke. I didn't think you'd really be here, he said, his voice low and uneven, eyes on the ground. Clara turned, looking at him, not the man in the defendant's chair, but the boy who used to fidget at her kitchen table, who once cried over a broken toy and a deeper hidden hurt no. One had explained. I never stopped wondering where you were, she said softly. He nodded, biting the inside of his cheek. I should have come sooner. I should have tried. I didn't know if I deserved to. Clara stepped a little closer, not touching him, just shortening the distance. Her voice was gentle but resolute. You were never lost to me, Mason. Not once. He looked up at her then. Really looked. Eyes glassy, jaw clenched. The boy was still there. Just older now and bruised in different ways. I used to think, Mason began, then paused, struggling to find the words. I used to think what happened when they moved me. That maybe you didn't want me back. That maybe you didn't fight. Clara's breath caught. She reached into her purse and pulled out the photo again, creased and faded from years of, unfolding. It showed Mason at 11, arms folded but smirking in the corner of her kitchen. Behind him, Clara stood smiling with flour dusted on her apron. She handed it to him without a word. Mason stared at it. I fought, she said quietly. But the system doesn't always listen to women like me. They stood in silence again, not needing to fill the space this time. The truth had found its way through. A piece of broken history, long buried, was now in the open, raw but ready to be healed. I don't know how to start fixing things, Mason finally said. You already did, Clara replied. You spoke. They didn't hug. Not yet, the wounds weren't ready for that kind of touch, but when Clara turned to walk, Mason fell in step beside her. No words, just the sound of their feet against the pavement. Side by side, as the wind carried away the echoes of a courtroom, and the beginning of something new settled gently between them. 2 years had passed, and yet, for Clara Jenkins, it felt both like a lifetime and the blink of an eye. The city's foster care benefit gala was held in a modest community center, lit with string lights and humming with soft music and chatter. Nothing extravagant, nothing that tried too hard, just warmth, real human warmth. The kind Clara had spent most of her life trying to give to others. She stood near the back of the room in her usual quiet way, wearing a soft navy dress, silver, curls pinned neatly. Her hands were folded over a simple clutch, but her eyes sparkled as they followed Mason across the room. He was on stage now, behind a microphone, in a crisp white shirt and sleeves rolled just enough to show the tattoo he once hated, now reclaimed. His voice was stronger than she remembered, steady with purpose and quiet pride. I don't usually speak at things like this, he began, scratching the back of his neck, eliciting a chuckle from the crowd. But someone told me it's not about being perfect, it's about being honest. He looked out across the audience, then right to Clara. Their eyes met. I spent years thinking I didn't matter, that I was just another case file, another mistake waiting to happen. But there was a time when I was a kid when one woman made me feel like I belonged, even when I didn't believe it myself. Clara's fingers curled a little tighter around her clutch. She didn't wear a cape. She didn't have money, she just stayed. Even when the system pulled me away, she stayed in my memory like a heartbeat I couldn't forget. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She's here tonight, Mason said, voice catching just slightly. And if you want to know the real reason I'm alive, it's her. He gestured toward Clara. She's not just my foster mom, she's my mother. The room rose in applause, but Clara remained seated for a moment, holding back tears. Not out of pride, though she felt it swell in her chest, but out of something deeper, something sacred, healing perhaps. Later that night, when the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, Clara returned home. The house was quiet, as always. She walked into the living room toward the small wooden desk in the corner. Her fingers reached instinctively for the drawer, the one she never stopped opening whenever the past felt too close. She took out the old photograph, creased, faded, once a tether to memories both sweet and broken, and beside it she placed the new one. Mason, grown and grinning, stood beside her with his arm wrapped around her shoulders. They were standing outside the very courthouse where everything had changed, where he had called her mom, where something broken had started to mend. Clara smiled. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need the world to know her name. But she had something more, legacy, and the unshakable truth that love, when it's real, when it's patient, never vanishes. It plants roots in silence, and one day blooms.